and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Connection is Key, the Importance of Caregiving and Supportive Adults for Youth Impacted by Trafficking. This webinar is brought to you by the National Center on Child Trafficking. The NCCT is a national collaborative of professionals who are developing trauma-informed interventions and resources to improve the lives of children and families impacted by sex and labor trafficking. This is the fourth webinar in an 8-webinar series, which reviews concepts from the NCCT's mental health treatment guidelines for youth who've experienced trafficking. This graphic illustrates 10 key elements of trauma treatment with youth impacted by trafficking. The guidelines offer recommendations in each of these areas for mental health and substance use treatment professionals working with this population. This webinar will explore caregiver involvement. The mental health treatment guidelines highlight the importance of partnering with caregivers and other supportive adults in the youth's life, whenever possible and clinically appropriate, to maximize youth's relational strengths and enhance their well-being. Today, our presenters will address how therapists can provide support, psychoeducation, and skill building to caregivers of trafficked youth to address a wide range of needs. These services can be offered in conjunction with youth services, whether concurrently or conjointly. Let's start by setting the stage on who we mean when we say caregiver. Youth who've experienced caregiving or exploitation have a variety of caregiving situations and may have multiple caregivers or changing caregiving contexts. We're defining caregivers widely, including anyone with responsibility for the relative safety and protection of youth. This may include bio parents, kinship placements, or other supportive family members, foster or adoptive parents, and/or adults within caregiving systems, such as staff within congregate care settings, survivor mentors, or other resource adults. It's important to be flexible when considering who might be an important caregiver in a youth's life, and to recognize that there may be varying involvement for different caregivers and different types of involvement for any one caregiver over time. In today's webinar, we'll explore 3 key areas: assessing the potential involvement of caregivers in treatment, supporting caregiver engagement and building a working alliance, and intervention with caregivers, offering support, education, and skill development. We're pleased to welcome our presenters today, Dr. Dawn Blacker and Dr. Jihan Omar. Dr. Blacker is a clinical psychologist and Director of Operations and Training at the UC Davis Care Center in the Department of Pediatrics, University of California Davis Children's Hospital. Over the past 25 years, Dr. Blacker has had primary clinical and research interests that involve trauma within the family context and evidence-based practices. Dr. Blacker oversees 2 contracts with Sacramento County Probation and Child Protective Services that provide training and services for sexually exploited youth and their caregivers. She's co-developed a web course on sexual exploitation and a caregiver skills group curriculum for caregivers caring for youth with a history of sexual exploitation. Dr. Blacker is also co-chair of the NCTSN Child Trafficking Work Group. Welcome, and thank you for being here, Dr. Blacker. Dr. Omar is a licensed clinical psychologist and is the clinical coordinator at Citrus Health Network for foster care and the Chance program, which serves adolescents impacted by commercial exploitation. Dr. Omar has supervised and coordinated a variety of programs for children and adolescents with severe emotional and behavioral difficulties, including an evaluation and treatment service for adolescents under intensive juvenile probation, a residential treatment facility for adolescents, and an intensive in-home treatment program for youth, including victims of commercial sexual exploitation. Dr. Omar, we appreciate your joining us today. I'd like to start off with this question for both of you. Why is it important to have caregivers involved in treatment when working with youth who've experienced trafficking?
Thank you, Dr. Hopper. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're calling from. I'm calling in from California, so it is still morning time. So thank you I'm super excited to be invited to talk about this topic. So thank you for that opportunity. So I think to answer this question, I want to just talk briefly about my clinical experience and sort of the biases that I had when I first started working with sexually exploited youth. Because when I first started doing it, I worked mostly with the youth themselves and not specifically their biological parents or caregivers, in part because the way that the system was designed when we first started doing the work, which was most of the youth were either in a juvenile justice system. And so, but that being said, my colleague and I myself were requested to do a caregiver skills group for caregivers who had youth who either were at risk or had a history of being sexually exploited. And so we created this curriculum, a skills group, and so I was able to be exposed or have interaction with a wide range of caregivers. And one thing that struck me was just depending on the situation, and we'll talk more specifically about the barriers that we may have with specific caregivers, but recognizing that a lot of these caregivers were really doing the best that they can, and also were experiencing a lot of significant distress related to their child being sexually exploited. And so I think that assuming that safety is not a significant issue with the caregiver, most of the youth that we are working with, unless they're in congregate care, are going to be either returned to a caregiver, whether it's a resource family member, a kin placement, or a biological parent. And so I think we have to recognize that. And really, that's the goal, particularly if the placement can provide safety and stability for the youth. So those are just a couple of thoughts of why I think it's important to involve the caregivers in treatment.
And if I may add, as Elise reported, I run the Chance program at Citrus Health Network in sunny South Florida. And Chance, one of the major themes of that program, and it's a program developed to work with youth who are in child welfare, and developing specific safe foster homes for them. So we recognized when developing this model how central it was to have the caregivers involved, trained, and really part of that process for the youth to really make success. Because that really is what sets it aside from other types of treatment models, is the intense focus on the training that the foster parents receive, these kind of specialized Green Beret foster parents, that we recognized how important the caregiver role was. So ultimately, when you work with youth, you work with caregivers no matter what setting they're in, whether it's group homes, whether they're in their biological family or relative care, or whether they're in child welfare in different types of foster home settings. So we recognize the environment is so central to being able to kind of support those youth. So it was important for us to both support the foster parents and provide them with these intensive training and skills, because we knew that the few hours a week that we provide the services as practitioners wouldn't in and of itself be enough if we didn't have that buy-in from the caregivers. So they ultimately would provide a lot of feedback to us as well. So it would be very important to have their input, because the child and the caregiver has so much more interaction than we would on a regular basis.
Absolutely, that child within the context is so important. And so with that assumption that it's preferable to involve caregivers whenever possible, what do therapists need to consider when assessing the potential involvement of a caregiver in treatment? How do we start thinking about that?
I think first and foremost, we definitely have to consider the youth. It's something that often goes unrecognized. It's almost prescriptive when we talk about providing services to youth and caregivers. You provide your family therapy, you provide your youth, and you expect the parents to kind of go along. But we can't always assume that either the youth or the parent is on board. And so, while we really want the parents involved, a lot of them have a lot of ambivalence. And both the youth and the caregivers working with us. So we really want to consider the youth's perspectives. First and foremost, who is in the caregiving role to the youth? Like we said earlier, many of them are in foster homes. Many of them have been in long-term foster homes. Some of them are with their biological family of origin or adoptive family or newly pre-adoptive family or a relative caregiver. But it doesn't mean that those are, stable or secure relationships. So it's really important for us to understand, the real depth of that relationship. We want to get the youth's consent. What does that mean? If we don't have their consent, it doesn't happen. No, but it means that we know we have to work a little bit harder because, again, we need their buy-in. And the goal would be to get them to shift to saying, okay, I want to do this. I recognize that, I want to talk with my caregiver more. I want them to be a support to me, so that they can improve those relationships. And in doing so, we want to explore what the concerns are for the youth as well. For instance, we had a youth a couple of years ago who was removed from her parents' care and placed in child welfare. Neither of the parents were offending parents, but she had a very toxic relationship with the biological mother, and then eventually was placed with her biological father, who she had no relationship with. So while this person, the father, was extremely dedicated, really wanted to assist her however he could, she didn't feel like she had a relationship with him or knew him. Knew he hadn't even been in proximity to her to harm her, but still felt very threatened by him being the identified caregiver. So we wanted to be able to support her by kind of helping her work through those concerns and kind of going at her pace and what did she need specifically to make that work. So it is really important to then examine that relationship with the caregiver and the youth. Many of them are very invested in participating. And sometimes because of the dynamics, because of the situations that have led them into being trafficked, it's caused a lot of water under the bridge between the child and their caregiver. And there might be conflict there. The youth might have concerns about feeling like I'm going to be punished further if, things come out, or I don't feel safe. Or, they might have a different goal or expectation than the parent or caregiver. So it is really important to work with them to kind of help kind of understand a little bit more as to what some of the difficulties are, so we can further support those relationships.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Amar. I just wanted to add something that you said that I think is relevant. It's important to recognize also that you may be working with different caregivers at different points in the time when you're working with your client and the youth, because it may be that you're working with a foster placement or congregate care, and then the youth is being returned to their biological parents, part of reunification. And so you have to sort of toggle back and forth or switch sort of what your focus is. So I just wanted to point that out as well. And that these are often the youth that we work with, particularly ones who have a history of being sexually exploited that we're talking about. The complexity is there. And it because of their history and being exploited, because of their risky behaviors that they have, and then because of the complexity of what may be going on with their family and the caregivers that that are caring for them. So it creates a lot of complexity that we all have to kind of manage as clinicians. Some other factors to consider when you're thinking about the youth perspective, sometimes it really just depends on the legal involvement. Some of the youth may be involved in both systems, depending on where you are located and how the state is managing youth who are being sexually exploited. They could be both in the juvenile justice system as well as the child welfare system, or one or the other. And so there may be less sort of control in sort of our clinical decision making about the caregiver, as well as the youth may not have as much voice in terms of what is the plan in terms of where they're going to be placed and cared by. Also, the mental health needs of the caregiver, as Dr. Amar alluded to, and we're going to elaborate a little bit more in a little bit. The age of the youth is a consideration. So if it's a 12-year-old versus a 17-year-old, that is going to play a role, because 12-year-olds unfortunately have less of a voice than, say, a 17-year-old does. And then obviously consideration of the culture and of the youth and the caregivers and what values they may have depending on that. And then Are the youth's goals aligned with what the team is sort of emphasizing or wanting, or what the caregiver is wanting? And so those are certain other considerations that when we're thinking about whether or not a caregiver will be involved in our treatment of the youth that we're working with.
Okay, thank you. Do you want to talk a little bit about just some barriers that caregivers may face?
Yeah. And I think we, have touched on this in previous webinars when we talked about the importance of engagement. So it's important to kind of come back to this because we don't often think about the kind of external factors that contribute to caregivers who may be very well-meaning, but it appears, it may appear to the practitioner that they're uninvolved or disinterested. So for those of you, both Dr. Blacker and I shared that we come from like large cities. And so environmental barriers are very, very significant here. For instance, in Miami, from one part of Miami to another is an easy hour without traffic. Add traffic, add our constant weather problems, we're looking at an hour and a half minimum for traffic. And a lot of parents struggle with transportation, not only just how long it's going to take, but we've had people say, I have a car, I just don't have gas to put in my car. And so, we have then modeled and developed our programs around things like that. So then, we've started putting it on the road, so to speak. We'll come to you, we'll provide the services in home, because that reduces some of those environmental barriers. Another one is unstable housing. How are we going to help them kind of talk through these problems when they're facing these monumental issues of insecure housing, and right now post-pandemic it's more than ever, right? So skyrocketing rent rates, gouging by landlords to increase rent, immediate evictions and things like that, and just a lot of instability with regards to housing and security. So we may not know this immediately. And if you're working in child welfare, sometimes that's also a barrier for a child returning to their family's care, right? They don't have, stable housing. So it's unfortunate that that would be the barrier that would keep them from, having their child in the home. But, that is where we're at right now. So it is important to kind of think about these elements as, to a parent or to a caregiver, I can't think about this because this is what's going on and I have to worry about if we're going to have a roof over our heads. Many of the parents we've worked with obviously are full-time working parents and have jobs and have had struggles. I mean, if I had $1 for each time a parent told me I cannot do one more thing, I'm going to get fired from my job if I have to go pick her up, or if I have to go do this, if I have to, go to the school, go pick her up from the hospital. So, we're cognizant that some of them are kind of feel that they're hanging on by a thread in their different forms of employment. So we want to be able to provide support to them in those elements as well, that we're aware of it. So again, we try to figure out if there's ways that we can cater our services around that, evening services, weekend services, telephone services, things like that. And in general, do the services align? And I think Dr. Blacker touched on this a little bit earlier with the goals of the family. Are our services available? Are they effective? This family may not benefit from a psychoeducational group with other parents. This family may have a different cultural background that may impede their ability to kind of really relate. So we really want to make sure that we're not trying to give a kind of one size fits all in terms of, the services that we're offering to the families. And then finally, and this is unfortunately one we see a lot, and again, Dr. Blacker kind of touched on this, there's not necessarily an identified caregiver. We often see this with children who are in child welfare, like I said, that might be in congregate care settings like group homes, who may be newly placed in a foster home. So they have no contact with their biological family, but then there's this new parent who they don't really see as a caregiver, they see as a stranger. So we want to really be aware when we do that initial assessment to kind of be cognizant of some of the barriers, the true barriers that these caregivers are experiencing.
And that kind of leads us into some of those emotional, psychological barriers.
Yeah, and I can touch upon that. And another way of talking about it is sort of what we would call perceptual barriers. Sort of what are the things that are more about how a caregiver is perceiving the situation and how they're going to deal with it. So a lot of these examples on this slide really pertain to a caregiver who's a biological parent or potentially a kin parent. So I just want to highlight that. But it could be that the caregiver does have, and this is certainly a common experience from my clinical perspective, previous experiences with youth serving systems. So they've had previous involvement in child welfare systems, for example. And so they have, often negative experiences with that. And so that often may hinder their ability and willingness to engage in further services. Dr. Amor kind of talked about the services and what is available and what is effective. And often with our caregivers, they may not have an understanding of sort of what the system is. Why are all these people involved? Who is this person? Who is this peer advocate? Who is this social worker? Who is a probation officer? And sort of, it can be pretty overwhelming because at least in my county, obviously in California, obviously it depends on where you're from and located, sort of how is the community managing and working with you for sexually exploited and often it is a team, at least in my experience. And so that can be very overwhelming for caregivers. Another thing that definitely have dealt with clinically is often these caregivers have their own mental health issues. I can speak anecdotally that of the caregivers that we have worked with in our caregiver skills group that we have facilitated, which we'll talk about in a little bit, over 60% of them had clinically significant PTSD symptoms of their own. Now, we didn't ask them what the trauma exposure was, but they endorsed significant PTSD symptoms. Small number of N, but over 60 caregivers plus that we provided. And so this is a really common experience. A lot of them often have their own trauma history, particularly sexual abuse. They also may have a history of prior substance dependence, which has impacted their ability to care for their children previously, but now they're clean and sober, and now they have a youth who is being sexually exploited. So lots of complications and complexity for sure. Also, the quality of the relationship with the youth that we're working with. And we're going to talk a little bit more of how to sort of evaluate that and how to conceptualize that. Sort of alluded to this with the substance dependence, but often, particularly with bio parents, there may have been previous abuse and or neglect from the caregiver that is no longer happening, but it has not been specifically addressed or sort of processed or worked on. And so that really, as Dr. Amar indicated, can create a toxic relationship. And so you have to kind of manage that. Also, it could be, we don't know what the caregiver's role is in trafficking. We're going to talk about family facilitated trafficking in a little bit. But sort of, is this a situation where the caregiver is sort of not facilitating the trafficking, but also not stopping it from happening? Or there may be some secondary gain that the caregiver has. One thing I want to highlight also that is not on this slide is often these caregivers present with very significant shame and guilt about what is happening to their youth, what has happened to their youth, sort of also about if they've had a previous history of abuse, substance dependence, or neglect, which really makes it hard for them sometimes to be able to engage in services because they feel directly responsible for what has happened to their child. And then lastly, another perceptual barrier is sort of really a concrete barrier, but it creates challenges because the parents often feel sort of stymied and ineffective, is that they have really not very ineffective parenting skills. In my experience is often these parents were very permissive very early on. And then now when the youth is returning to their care, have become very authoritarian. And so they sort of toggle back and forth. And so there's no balance and they struggle. And keep in mind, we'll talk about this in a little bit, some of these youth do have really challenging behaviors that parents may have difficulty managing. And so that creates a situation that makes it potentially less likely get a caregiver will be willing to engage in services because of the difficulties surrounding that. All right, switching gears just a little bit. So this is a slide that we want you to be thinking about when you're considering determining whether a caregiver should be involved. And so the lovely colors indicate sort of where you want to be thinking. Is this sort of what we would call a red light caregiver or stop? Like we should be considering that this is a problematic situation that we would not be considering including the caregiver. Now, when you're looking at it, you want to also be thinking that these caregivers are not going to be read on all these different categories like safety, interest and motivation, self-regulation, stability, communication, and caregiving capacity. They may sort of be red on safety, but green on caregiving capacity. So and Dr. Amar is going to go in more in depth, but you really want to be thinking about that we want to consider these 6 categories to help determine whether a caregiver should be involved and where they fall between sort of what we would call being a red light caregiver, sort of like, hey, we really need to not engage at this time, and what are the things that we need to do to get them over to an area where they may be, I think Dr. Kinish calls this sort of the amber color, or moving towards green. And so part of your interventions, you may be sort of targeting certain of these categories in order to move them along. That being said, sometimes we are left with what we have, and so we have to work with what we have. And so you just want to be mindful of like, hey, this is really a significant concern. You know, they don't have housing. You know, I'm thinking of a case example that one of my colleagues is working with. It's a 16-year-old youth, and her father seems to have a substance abuse issue, has housing, but is maybe manufacturing drugs in his home. So that raises lots of concerns related to the stability and safety that he can provide. So he would be more in the red area. So I think Dr. Amar is going to, Amar is going to go ahead and elaborate on this.
Mhm. So looking more specifically at a couple of the dimensions, I want to introduce you to look at safety. And I think this is a really nice continuum when you think about, working with caregivers, to kind of always have in the back of your mind, are they a red on safety? Are they moving towards yellow, or are they a green on safety? Obviously green when it comes to safety is where we need to be, right? And as Dr. Blacker said earlier, different caregivers could kind of hit on different areas. So they could be red on one area and green on another area. And kind of how do those factors really affect the youth and the progress we're trying to make with the youth? So looking at safety as an example, someone in the red category, which is kind of like that danger sign, right? As they called it, stop, is someone who might kind of pose a safety concern. This is somebody who might be extremely permissive or isn't buying in with the system and doesn't feel like their child's been a problem and the child is kind of off and running around. They might be the person who actually was suspicious of harming them or failed to protect them in some of those areas where they were abused. And so they might not necessarily see a problem. So if we were kind of to liken it to, stages of change, we might see them in that pre-contemplative phase. So somebody, further in the yellow area, so they've made some progress, this particular caregiver. They might have recognized or understood that some of their previous behaviors, such as substance abuse, might have threatened their child's well-being, safety, and so on and so forth. But they're in a position where they are working on it. Sometimes, relapsing into occasional substance use or things like that, or not always being present, but they're kind of showing those steps. They, work the steps of their case plan, or they're, recognizing that perhaps this isn't the best type of role modeling for the youth. And then finally, the caregiver who is in the green is someone who is very aware of the safety threat, is doing everything they can to protect the child, not saying that the child is still safe, because of them alone, but is doing their part to continue to monitor that youth and to work with providers to kind of keep them safe and kind of hearing feedback and taking recommendations. So these are kind of like some of the different things to consider, and kind of would help kind of improve the quality of that treatment. Can move on. Now, interestingly, if we could go, is it interest and motivation is the next one, or self-regulation? Yeah, there you go. We often run into caregivers who have varying degrees of interest and motivation in services. And we touched on this a little bit earlier as well. And why is that? A lot of them are burned out, right? So somebody in the red category, again, is very resistant. I'm not the problem. The kid is the problem. I'm not going to participate. I'm not going to be made to be punished because of this youth. Or that's unfortunately a situation we've run into many, many times. Or it might be, you know, a foster parent who's like, listen, I have 7 other foster kids here. I do what you guys need to do. I'm not going to be involved. So, you know, and those are, you know, 2 different examples of things that actually have occurred. The caregiver who then is kind of moving in towards the yellow, the middle of the range, is somebody who's a little bit more ambivalent, right? They might be identifying multiple barriers like that we said earlier. Transportation is a problem. I have to work. I have, you know, other kids to think about. You know, I've gone down this path before. We've had family therapy before. Nothing has worked. So their motivation is is waning. And then finally, we have the caregivers where we all aspire to be, right? The caregivers who are highly motivated to participate in treatment, who recognize that, this is going to help them. And this is where we try to put, the chance foster parents who we train. We provide them with an intensive 24-hour training, and then there's that ongoing services. So not to say that they're perfect, but they're motivated. They know what they're getting themselves into. They recognize that there's going to be barriers, yet they still, and they've heard all the horror stories, if you will, but they still, want to provide the youth with that kind of intensive support that they really need. And yet another caregiver example is self-regulation. So again, how many of you, I know you can't respond, have thought about working with a caregiver who can be extremely reactive, struggles sometimes or appear to struggle with their own mental health issues, or we've often thought they might have contributed to the child's struggles themselves. So on the one extreme, we have the caregivers who, really, really struggle with regulating their own emotions. They might be extremely reactive or hostile towards the youth, towards the providers, towards the, treatment services. And then moving on down, we have the caregivers who demonstrate, some ability to regulate, but they don't always hear the feedback. So it kind of goes up and down. And then we have the caregivers on the far end who really show a lot of motivation, patience, ability to regulate their own emotions. But you can see where this can become problematic because it can be a very much a vicious cycle with the youth. So we have a parent currently who's working with one of our youth. This is a kinship type situation. So it's the grandmother. The biological mom has said that she couldn't work with the child. So in order to keep the child out of child welfare, the child has started living with the grandmother. The grandmother on these different categories has demonstrated, awareness that safety is important, awareness of the threats that have happened to her grandchild. When it comes to interest and motivation, I would put her in maybe yellow-ish or less, amber, as Dr. Kinnish had identified, and really kind of struggling with seeing that, this is going to work. So when the child starts to have a setback, it's, you guys aren't doing anything for my grandchild. She's never going to get better. But where we've really found the area that this grandparent has the most struggles with is in self-regulation. So this is a parent who then every time the child, and she continues to engage in, rule-breaking behavior and struggles, has these explosive arguments with the youth. It becomes very unregulated. The parent has even been alleged to have made threats to harm herself in the element. So we recognize that that then would put them in the red category, right? When it comes to self-regulation, because she's not able to kind of modulate that emotion and that affect she feels towards the youth, and it becomes a vicious cycle. So she says something like that to the child reacts by walking off, leaving, running away, and then we start the process of victimization over. So these are some of the things that you want to take into account when you're working with the caregivers in terms of where are they on each of these factors and each of these levels across the spectrum, and how are they really helping our youth? So if we can go to the next slide.
Yeah, and so what Dr. Moore has said, sort of just thinking of it, you're not going to have a caregiver who's going to have all of these sort of 6 main factors that we've identified all in the same sort of scale. They're going to be sort of all over the place. And so part of it is the reason why we're providing this is just to help you with your conceptualization. So when you're assessing sort of what are the needs of the caregiver and sort of what level of involvement the caregiver will have in your care, you would be using this as sort of a guidepost, as as one way to look at it.
And if I could add, think about it in terms of what are the negotiables and non-negotiables. For instance, safety is a non-negotiable. If we feel that this parent caregiver is in the red category for safety, do any of the others matter? So that is a non-negotiable. We're putting ourselves in abuse report calls and whatnot. But if it's self-regulation, where they're kind of in the amber category or occasionally go back and forth, it's not linear. Is that something that we can assist them with, perhaps provide them that, support that they might need, help them link with services or things like that could help move them along? If we start to recognize that that's using the example I said earlier, perhaps if she didn't become so reactive to the youth's behavior, would she be able to make better choices in terms of her parenting capacities with this youth? So I think it really is a helpful spectrum to really consider when you guys work with caregivers.
Just real quick, when you're we have this slide just to help with the conceptualization when you're trying or thinking about sort of the quality of the relationship between the caregiver and youth as part of your assessment in determining whether a caregiver should be or will be participating in services with you and the youth. And this comes from a colleague, Dr. Anthony Urquiza, and has been applied when conducting child welfare bonding, quote unquote, bonding assessments, and sort of thinking about what we're talking about with like the quality of the relationship. And so, you can, and really thinking of 2 broad categories, strength, and then sort of the quality or the type. And so you can have, if you look at this slide, you can have a relationship that is weak, meaning it's sort of, there's not a lot there, but it's positive, generally speaking. And so this may be a situation where a caregiver, sort of like the example before of the father who had not had any contact with their youth. So there's nothing negative there, but it's really weak because there's not that connection. The strength is not there. Versus if you're really lucky to have, I think this is less likely to happen with most of the clients that we're working with, where you have a very positive, the quality of the relationship positive, and the strength in the relationship is very strong. And so that happens less often in these situations, I would say, in my experience. And then sometimes it can be a weak, meaning there's little contact, and it's also very negative. And so this may be a situation where, say there was previous abuse that occurred, the child was removed from their care and out of their care for a period of time and had no contact with their parent, and now they're being reunified with their parent. So that would be an example of sort of weak and negative. And then strong and negative, I think we would all sort of classify as sort of what we could call it a toxic relationship. But this is where you have the youth is attached or connected to their caregiver, and the parent has either been abusive or is extremely punitive, negative, very controlling. And yet the youth is still attached to them. I would say, generally speaking, my experience is often that is where my clients fall in. and sort of they have a strong attachment, and yet it's a very negative type of relationship. So this is just another way to kind of conceptualize your youth and their caregivers and think about sort of, well, where do I need to be targeting?
That kind of brings us into one really specific scenario with caregivers, which is family facilitated trafficking. Can you just talk a little bit more about that situation and how clinicians might think about that?
Yes, just, the caveat is that, there's not a lot of data out there. And so this is some of the things that we do know. And I can say, depending on where you're at, et cetera, I have had less experience with this clinically. I mean, certainly I've had situations where I have caregivers who may sort of know that their child is being exploited. And I want to point out that there's a difference between sort of facilitation and condoning. And we're talking about family facilitated trafficking in this situation. And so there is some data, a study by Flores Project found that 37% of those respondents experienced familial sex trafficking. That's almost 40%. That's pretty high, I would say. We also know, when you're thinking about it, that if the trafficking has happened by a family member, that 100% adds complexity to your treatment with limited research. And I think it would be very similar to, say, if you were working with someone who is a perpetrator of sexual abuse. And so I generally speaking, from a clinical perspective and a personal boundary, professional boundary, often will not work with a caregiver who was actively exploiting their own child. I'm curious to know what Dr. Amar says about that, but I mean, I think we have to be very cautious about that. And that certainly would fall in the red, amber, red, or super bright red category of safety. Another study that was done in 2018 that looked at family facilitated trafficking did find that in general that the victims were younger compared to other sexually exploited youth, that the perpetrator often included the boyfriend of a mother, and that there was substance abuse involvement, meaning that the primary caregiver, the mother, may have a substance dependence, and that that was associated with it. There was also generational involvement in the trafficking. So the mother had been trafficked, and so then it resulted in part in their child being trafficked. Obviously, intergenerational trauma, although I don't think that's unique to family facilitated trafficking in my clinical experience. And then we do know that sometimes the family members indirectly benefit from the youth trafficking from a financial perspective. And so that's what I mean when I talk about condoning. And this often occurs with adolescents, where the caregiver knows that they're involved in sexual exploitation, but is really not doing anything to reduce from happening. So I don't know, Dr. Amar, do you have any clinical experience with this? I have less clinical experience.
Unfortunately, significant. Anecdotally, there's been two things we noticed. Obviously, we don't have to work with the traffickers. I know you asked that earlier, because usually when that comes up and it's identified early on, their parental rights are likely terminated, or they're in jail while it's being terminated. So we have that caveat. But what we found, and we found frequently when it's situations of family facilitated trafficking, is suspicion, or the child discloses years down the line or much longer. And so those are some of the struggles that we found, is that those things don't often get reported immediately. And so we'll find out that the child's been back and forth with the mom, back and forth with the parent. And, recently I had, I think once, a 21-year-old tell me that her parent was still trying to pull her back into the life. And still trying to, and so during a moment of weakness, she was considering it because she was experiencing some financial distress. So yeah, I definitely would underscore what you said in terms of just the lack of research about it, but because it's often so hard to identify. And for some reason, they know that this is something that doesn't get disclosed as quick. So we found it more often than not, and I don't think it's a coincidence, because then obviously they end up in child welfare for that reason.
Yeah, and I think I would just add to that. I know we have to move on and get to the next topic. But I think that just if you're thinking about conceptually why that is less likely to be reported per se, or there's a delayed disclosure, and that's just because they're family members, and there's a lot of reasons similar to like why do kids don't tell about sexual abuse. Often they don't disclose if the perpetrator is someone who is a caregiver for them or sort of providing financial support or support for that. So it's just a lot harder and challenging to disclose if a family member is exploiting you.
Thank you for that complicated discussion.
So in kind of when we think about really kind of assessing, the caregiver's role and their involvement, the key points we want to highlight are to really consider where the youth is coming from. What is their perspective on this? What is their level of engagement, investment, and involvement with their caregiver? Who are the caregivers? Be cognizant of the barriers, the actual, physical, concrete barriers that may interfere with caregiver engagement. I mean, we're aware of resistance and ambivalence and those factors, but for many, they do come from lower, socioeconomic backgrounds or have different responsibilities or concerns that are those basic needs. And it's important for us to be aware and supportive of them in helping them kind of navigate those. And then finally, use a framework for determining the types of caregiver involvement that's the most beneficial for the youth. What does that mean? Help meeting them where they're at, making sure it's not a one size fits all, recognize that change occurs, what works for one family may not work for another family, what works for one family from one cultural perspective may not work, which is why we really try to develop these models that are community-based, and really kind of hear, the youth and families' voice and choice.
So in the second webinar in this series, we talked about youth engagement, and today we're really kind of circling back around on that topic, but focusing in on the importance of engaging caregivers when working with youth who experience trafficking. So we also talked about all these barriers facing caregivers. So what are some of the ways that therapists can support caregiver buy-in and engagement with the youth treatment?
Excellent question. I think that one of the first things you can do, and again, I want you to be mindful of your own biases that you have about the parents, particularly if they're the biological parents, and just speaking from my own clinical experience. But the first thing you can do is really recognize and validate the valid caregivers' emotional reactions that they have to what is happening to their youth. And this can be also for kin caregivers, foster resource family caregivers. They are experiencing a pretty significant amount of stress and lots of really negative feelings. We also know that there's some people in the UK, an organization called PACE, and they've actually done some research about caregivers, and in their data that they have, about 40% of caregivers are experiencing significant physical symptoms in addition to the emotional distress that they're experiencing. And so this lovely slide is adapted from our colleague, Dr. Kelly Kinnish, and just kind of highlights all the variety of different feelings that these caregivers are experiencing. And so you want to be very validating. A lot of their feelings that they're experiencing are very typical and common. And I think one thing that when we talked about when we worked with our caregivers is recognizing that the amount of shame that is attached to people who are involved in sex trafficking is pretty significant often. And so it's not like a caregiver can go to their best friend and say, hey, you know what, this is happening to my child. Because often the response is, well, why aren't you doing anything? Why haven't you done anything? How could you let this happen? So people often respond with a lot of shame and blame. And so they have really nowhere else to go. So they feel very isolated. So I think just, you want to be thinking about the variety of different feelings that they're experiencing and provide validation for that.
And I think you don't want to underscore that sense of helplessness as well. You know, a lot of parents and caregivers, there's no parent and caregiver who doesn't think that they should have some level of control over the youth in their home. And so that sense of helplessness and you know, not knowing what to do about that is a hard pill to swallow, especially if they've been dealing with it for some time. So in looking at this slide, we're talking about strategies to increase their engagement, kind of being cognizant of, you know, some of the things we told you that, you know, that they have, you know, barriers, they have emotional reactions, they've been going through this a lot longer with that particular child than we have. So something that practitioners sometimes miss the bus on is that they don't always realize how important it is to engage that that parent or caregiver early on, inviting them to participate, hearing them, listening to them, because we have, you know, time limits and requirements, and I'm the individual therapist, and that's what I'm supposed to do. But it is important to engage them. Another thing is provide that validation. They just, you know, if we refer back to the previous slide, most families have all of those things that they're going on. They feel isolated, they feel hopeless, they feel helpless, they feel burnt out, so on and so forth. And so, you know, what do they get? They get, okay, you have this appointment here, we have a court date, the child protective investigator is going to be calling you, the detective is going to call you, you need to be here, you need to be there. And no one's kind of validated what their experience is like and how hard and challenging this has been for them as well. They didn't sign up for this. Oftentimes they didn't expect to kind of have this circumstance. So kind of validating that their experience has been challenging as well. It's very easy for us in terms of worldview to kind of have that type of judgment towards a parent. Because many of them, the circumstances of their own actions, you know, substance misuse, absence, things like that, might have contributed to the child's difficulties. But it is important for the providers to avoid blaming and shaming them because they're here now. Some aren't, but they are. So that in and of itself is meaningful. We want to provide some skills quickly. Why is that? Because if you walk in and you're like, hey, things are going to get better in a year, but for now, I just want you to talk to me for the next year until things start to get better. They're going to be like, thank you. I think I've signed up for something else. So you want to give them that kind of sense of, okay, I have some control. I have some sense of hope. You know, it's like going into a restaurant and saying you want to order and then them telling you the food wasn't going to be ready for 2 or 3 hours. Well, here's an appetizer to get you started. And so this is kind of what we're thinking about, that you want to give them a little something so they have that sense of control and hope. And even if it's something as simple as helping them develop a safety plan, you know, I know it's going to be a struggle. It's providing that validation and providing that safety plan. So here's what we're going to do when things start to go rough, so that they know that they have that contact with you. For instance, you're going to call me, you're going to call the team, you're going to do X, Y, and Z, but they have something tangible to hold on to, an anchor, if you will. You want to not only work aligning with the youth, because what happens if you align solely with the youth and not the parent? You lose the parent. And if you lose the parent, ultimately you lose the child. So you definitely want to work with aligning with both of them together, and making sure that they both feel that as the practitioner, and it might be a little bit of a dance, but as the practitioner, you know, are there to support everybody. Meet the caregiver where they're at. You know, some are in that basic needs phase. They need, you know, to focus on housing, and I need to get a job, and I need this, that, and the other, and I have to focus on my other kids. Okay, so how can we help you do that and provide you that support you need? Recognize that many caregivers have, you know, secondary traumatic stress or compassion fatigue. They're caregivers like everyone else who, you know, work with, you know, chronic conditions, and they will burn out. And, you know, like Dr. Blacker said, might even have some physical symptoms. So they have, you know, experienced a lot. We joined 12 to 15 years later. We don't know what everything has happened up until that point. So we want to be cognizant of the fact that their struggles are affecting them, but then ultimately affect the youth as well. And then finally, and I think we've touched on this a couple of times, is to continue to address those unmet needs. And I think Dr. Blacker wants us to talk a little bit more about those.
Yeah, and I think just in the interest of time, so we can kind of move on to the next part, just so you all know that we've already talked about that there may be sort of the what we call sort of the Maslow hierarchy of needs, of the physical things that they need to be taken care of, and that these caregivers may have things that need to be addressed in order for them to be able to safely and adequately care for their youth. And so this is where, if you're lucky enough to be able to have a family advocate or having people who are provide case management, hopefully either if a social worker is involved, but sort of meeting those unmet needs. So then you can provide the mental health services for the youth, and the client, the caregiver is really important. You can go ahead and move to the next slide. The other thing I wanted to add related to that, I find this a very effective sort of framework, both with my clients and also with the caregivers. And this comes from dialectical behavior therapy, and one of its tenets, which is that we believe that, youth and caregivers and system providers are all doing the best that they can, and they need to try harder. And so I think if you come from that perspective, sort of dialectically, that can go a long way for you. So the key points related to engagement and alliance building with caregivers is, recognize and validate their valid caregivers' perspectives and emotions. And the reason why I say valid, because obviously you're not going to validate things that are not valid. So that's important. Obviously, depending on the situation, depending on what the plan is that the team has decided on, if they're involved in child welfare versus juvenile justice, really, and this is something that I had to learn from my own experience, you really should be attempting to engage the caregivers pretty early and sort of ongoing. This allows for you to be able to assess too, provide ongoing assessment to determine whether or not they're sort of in those categories of safety, et cetera, sort of in the red, amber, or green area. And so trying to do the best that you can to include whoever the current caregiver is, and then potentially who may the future caregiver may be. Ideally, in a perfect world, if we have a youth who's in a congregate care, and then they're being returned to their biological parent, which is often what happens in California, providing that support with the caregiver prior to their kid being returned to them. That would be ideal. And then obviously, I think hopefully a lot of you know, when you're working with youth who have a history of being sexually exploited, that you really have to have a team approach, both for the youth as well as the caregiver, and specifically in this situation to address those unmet needs, because that will help with engagement, and it will help with the caregiver's capacity to engage in such services.
All right, so let's get into some of the meat of caregiver intervention and just talk about some of your recommendations for what clinicians might do with caregivers. What are some of the primary intervention goals and strategies when working with caregivers whose children have experienced trafficking?
Yes, I can get us started on that. So when you're thinking about both goals and strategies, one of the first things you want to be thinking about, of course, is providing support for the caregiver, making sure that their basic needs are being met for stability, ensuring that you are providing lots of validation, which we'll talk about in a little bit more, and then sort of a connection, that you are connecting with the caregivers. And so, making sure that they have access to treatment for themselves, decrease their feelings of isolation, normalizing their experience and reactions that they may be having related to their youth being sexually exploited, and making sure, again, like their basic needs are being met. Another goal is really a psychoeducation, and that is really with the purpose of increasing the caregiver's understanding of their child or the client, the youth that they're caring for, with an understanding of trauma, sort of the dynamics of child sex trafficking, and what are very sort of concrete intervention strategies that they could be using. And so, the psychoeducation would include providing information about the myths that we have about child sex trafficking, as well as sort of the dynamics of sex trafficking, particularly related to the perpetrators and psychological coercion and identity disturbance. And then another goal would be developing the caregiver skills that will be able to strengthen the relationship that they have with their kiddo that they're caring for, ensuring and building safety, and then giving them more advanced parenting strategies to deal with some of the maybe riskier behaviors that some of these youth may be exhibiting. And Jihan, I didn't know if you wanted to add to that.
No, I think we'll do a deeper dive a little bit more on the support in just a moment. So if we can kind of go into that. I know that Dr. Blacker talked about validation, and we've said it repeatedly throughout the webinar today in terms of how important it is. So that's why our first point was, providing validation, lots of validation, for the caregivers to feel heard, to feel like somebody is understanding them and supporting them. So you have to think about it from the perspective of what they have walked into. They've often been in this, position of action and reaction. Your child, this is what's going on with your child. You need to do this, you need to do this, you need to do that. You need to get down here, you need to be at this meeting, you need to provide us with this information or that information. And it often is overwhelming. We know that, they have a lot of burdens on their own just in regular parenting, and the point where the child got to where they're at this point. So often by the time our role comes in, the parent is very burnt out and they don't feel heard, they don't feel supported, they just feel like being instructed all the time. And so it would be really beneficial to the treatment to make sure that they are getting the support that as well, and getting heard. And part of doing that is then going into the next point, which is providing them psychoeducation about, secondary trauma, compassion fatigue, and, their own self-care strategies. Parents don't often recognize the amount of distress that they may be under just because, like I said, they are just in react mode. And this is directly related to the experience that the youth has had, the child. And it may not necessarily be a biological parent or a relative, like we've said before, or a foster parent, but sometimes just having that experience and going through it with the child can be very demanding. And helping them kind of identify different coping mechanisms. We had a parent once who was just very extremely agitated and short-tempered, and almost every time she addressed the child, she was very irritable with her. And until we were able to kind of have that rapport with her by, the frequent use of validation and engaging her and letting her kind of share her own frustrations, we could give her that feedback and kind of bring it to her attention. But in doing so, she wasn't even aware of that. And we were really able to recognize it as a function of that, secondary trauma, that she didn't get to process the trauma that she went through, because it was all focused on the child. So, that is important. And so in many of those cases, they can be, benefit from being linked to their own services, having an individual therapist. Now, with the increased use of telehealth, it makes it much more accessible for parents. So many parents, especially in the child welfare system, might be mandated to services. So there's that level of resentment towards it. But for some, we found it very beneficial when we've been able to kind of provide them with the family therapy or provide them with additional individual therapy on their own and kind of help link them to it, because it's just one less thing that they have to do to follow up.
Yeah, and Dr. Amar, I just want to add something that you said, two things. One, when we're talking about providing psychoeducation about secondary traumatic stress and compassion fatigue, and a metaphor that we often use with the caregivers that we work with is this idea of, like, if you are flying, what do the flight attendants tell you to do if there's an emergency? And you're traveling with your kid, you're supposed to put the oxygen mask on yourself first and then your child, because you can't really help your child or your youth if you are not being able to function. And so that is a really important thing to consider. And the other thing I just want to highlight is, because there have been, my colleague and I, Dr. Brandy Lyles, have created a caregiver skills group curriculum. And I think just thinking about, the slide says caregiver support, and I just want to be mindful that the support includes sort of the umbrella of both sort of support and validation and decreasing their sense of hopelessness and isolation of sort of being only on their own and being the only one that's sort of experiencing these things that they're experiencing, and giving them specific skills to be able to intervene and interact with their youth in an effective manner. And so that's why we called it a skills group versus a support group, because support group is just sort of a gathering, and you get to hear sort of people's experiences that may be similar to yours. And often these caregivers need lots of intervention and skills in order to be able to effectively engage with the youth that they're caring for. This is me. Apologies. So when you're thinking about psychoeducation resources, we've kind of touched upon it a little bit, but you're thinking about you want them to have an understanding of child sexual abuse. As we know, there's high percentage of youth who've been sexually exploited, who also have a history of being sexually abused. And so that's important. You also want to be able to give them information about the dynamics of child trafficking, including psychological coercion, sort of what are the tactics that perpetrators used in order to get the youth to become exploited. We definitely want them to have an understanding of what are the common trauma symptoms that our youth may be experiencing, and then also trauma triggers for both the youth and the caregiver. And so, if you're thinking about that, an example, a really concrete example that I have is we had a caregiver who was visiting her child on the weekends because the youth was in a residential treatment facility. And the caregiver wondered if meeting at a hotel and having a visit at a hotel would be a trauma trigger for her kid. And so that's, and understandably so, particularly if she'd been sexually exploited in hotels, which we know is a common thing. And so if getting a caregiver to think about, oh, my kid is not behaving aggressively because they're just trying to be aggressive. It could be that they're reacting to something that is because of a trauma trigger. And so helping the caregiver understand sort of what the function of some of the behaviors that the youth may be exhibiting can be really beneficial for everyone. And so that caregiver actually had a conversation with her daughter about like, hey, I'm wondering if us being at a hotel for our visit is going to be a problematic thing. And the youth was able to sort of reflect upon it and, say like, no, I think I'll be okay. And I'll let you know if it becomes an issue, so I think that's a really beautiful example of that. Also, you want to talk about how to be more trauma responsive. And I think that's, the example I just gave is a beautiful example, if I say so myself, of sort of what does it mean to be trauma responsive in your parenting. You also want to, like I said, these caregivers need behavioral strategies to deal with some of the more severe behaviors that the youth may be exhibiting, as well as how do we reduce their harm to them. And I'll talk about that in a little bit more, but how do we get caregivers to use harm reduction strategies when it is appropriate to be implementing those strategies? So specifically related to harm reduction. And so this is something that often, I think, not just caregivers, but other team members may sometimes have a hard time with sort of buying into harm reduction approaches. And part of that, the reasons for the reluctance towards harm reduction interventions and concepts is often it feels like from others that you are condoning the risk behaviors or you are allowing to do it. If you weren't using harm reduction strategies, then you are facilitating it. And so one thing I kind of talk about is, by one example would be facilitating is that you drive your youth down to a place so they can purchase drugs. That would be facilitating the risky behavior. And condoning it. That is not a harm reduction strategy. And so sort of getting people to think a little bit differently. Another reason why caregivers have a hard time is because of their own personal beliefs and values about drugs in particular, as well as sex. And so when you're working with caregivers and talking about harm reduction strategies, you often have to come from a place of validating sort of their own beliefs and perspectives. At the same time, sort of talk about what is our goal. And our goal is to keep youth safer versus safe. And really also ensure there's not severe harm or death, truthfully, that is caused or happens to the youth. And so getting caregivers to sort of think a little bit differently about what the goal is. And the ultimate goal is to hopefully remove them from being sexually exploited, remove them for being in situations where there's risk for severe harm or death. But we're moving towards a movement towards safer behavior. And so also we have to see where the caregivers are willing to let go, and what I would call sort of finding a middle path. And related to that, I think we have to, part of when you're talking about harm reduction strategies with caregivers is that you have to help caregivers understand and begin to recognize what is typical adolescent behavior and what is atypical adolescent behaviors. And so getting them to recognize that some of the behaviors that they're concerned about may just be typical adolescent behaviors. And so really focusing on those more risky behaviors. And then the other thing I would just add is often caregivers are reluctant to use harm reduction strategies because they are very fearful and worried about their child and what may happen to them. And so if you have an understanding of sort of what's driving their concern and related to implementation of harm reduction strategies, that can go a long way.
So when we think about this, we think about then what strategies do we teach our parents or do we help them implement? And we kind of think about the skills from a couple of different perspectives. And the first one is the relational skills. And there's that adage where, you won't be able to help them in the tough times if you don't have a relationship with them positively now. So if the parent or the caregiver already has a contentious relationship or a distant relationship or a strained relationship with the youth, when times get tougher and the parent may need to engage them in a different way, they're going to have a really hard time because they don't have that stay close relationship that it's sometimes referred to. So developing relational skills is just that, kind of helping the parent develop more positive, supportive relationship with the youth, getting to know them a little bit differently. People who are biological parents are going to say, but I know my kid. But do you really? Adolescents change. Adolescents will always say, that's why I don't tell you anything. So helping, really learn what their likes and dislikes are. Not, do they like pizza versus mac and cheese, but is it, they're interested in another peer at school and that's something that they haven't been able to share with you before. And previously, kind of using a more harm reduction approach, the caregiver or parent will be more open to kind of listening and not discouraging them from having romantic relationships where they might have gone the opposite extreme before, like no boys, no girls, no dating, versus, okay, let's talk about it. And what do you like about them? Or what do you like about them? Just to kind of help them feel that they have that trust, that supportive relationship, that lack of judgment. And there are actual models like trust-based relational intervention, TBRI, that really focus heavily on some of these skills. The other thing is developing healthy communication styles. Again, all focused on enhancing trust, improving safety in the end. And that's something as simple as active listening skills. Adolescents and caregivers are the primary people who are going to engage in those kind of arguments where they don't necessarily hear each other's side. This is my house, this is whatever. Teens may like to curse more and parents are very sensitive to that. I can't tell you how many times we've had to intervene in homes where the parent was just extremely rigid about hearing curse words, and that really triggered a lot of conflict. So these are the things where we say, okay, this is where you have to give a little bit. That you have to kind of be open to kind of hearing some of this and compromise on other areas. The next point would be spending time with youth doing positive activities. Again, caregivers and parents frequently identify positive activities as something that should be earned or rewarded. but that's not the case. And it is a shift in belief system for many that, play and positive activities should be a required part of any child or youth development. So recognizing that, there's, taking them to Disney World on one hand as a huge reward, or a concert, versus, spending time watching a movie in the evening, having popcorn, or family nights. So something like family night, if that's something that the clinician can help the family develop, or the caregiver, is something that should be done weekly, regardless of whether they're punished, they're grounded, so on and so forth, as that opportunity for the family to come together. They have this positive time set aside, positive activity, not based on any reward or punishment system. And oftentimes we, another big battle is, well, I'm not going to buy them this, and I'm not going to take them there, and I'm not going to let them have this because they have been misbehaving. But certain positive activities are important that should be nurtured. And then we talk about developing reinforcement system. And this is where it can be, really focused on, what the youth is interested in and what they like, and things that really have value for them. That, obviously we know the materialistic things like phones or extended curfew or things like that. But those are some of the things that, we really want the parent then to develop that reinforcement system based on that. I'll give you an example of something that, had more intrinsic value, not something so materialistic. We had a youth at some point, an HT youth was in a safe foster home, and the caregiver was really struggling with this youth's tendency to leave, to run. Well, this youth also happened to be a teen mom. She really wanted a relationship with her child. Her, I think, was a 1-year-old infant at the time. But because of her behaviors, wasn't always afforded the visitation unless it was supervised in a very clinical setting. And didn't have other people who would do the supervision. So what was worked on with the therapist and the foster parent and the child was that the foster parent said, if you show me that you can come back and you stay home for this amount of time, I will personally be the person who will do the supervised visits with your child. So that way she can be in the home. I'll commit to doing the supervised visit, and it'll feel more natural, and you'll feel more happy to be around the child. And so that's what they were able to do. And so, initially, we wouldn't have necessarily assumed that would have been such a motivating factor for her, because she seemed somebody who was running, not giving her child the attention she needed, but she was handling it like an adolescent would, kind of reacting the opposite of what she felt. And so knowing that this parent was going to go out on a limb and was going to do the supervised visits in the home, where, she had, a positive relationship with her, and she really felt that was moving her towards progress with her, reunifying with her child, really was an incentive that, without some really deep conversations and open communication, wouldn't have happened had they not been able to have that positive relationship. And then finally, kind of really increased understanding of the youth's past relationships, both positive, negative, and their impact on the relationships. And that, goes with what we were saying in terms of really trying to have those conversations with the youth that are non-judgmental, and I just want to get to know it, and, what's happened in the past will stay in the past, but let's talk about these things so I know, what you're thinking about and what bothers you. Yeah.
I love that example, Dr. Omar, of a contingency management for a couple of reasons. One, because it emphasizes the importance.
I was trying not to use behavioral terms, but good job. Moved it right to behavior management.
Well, I mean, I'm just thinking twofold. One is that highlights really the importance of, even if you have a youth who's leaving care or still actively being sexually exploited, there are things that they value that are important to them that are separate from being trafficked. And that was something where you're like, okay, she is very motivated. She wants to have a relationship with her daughter, which is fantastic. And, there's some of these barriers related to visits, which is why, and so she was probably feeling very scrutinized and judged in the more clinical setting and didn't feel very welcomed and supported in that regard. And then it was sort of like, hey, if this is something you are valuing and you want to do, and we need a little bit of behavioral change on your part in order to be able to do it. So it was
wasn't comfortable for the baby either. So the whole setting felt very uncomfortable for her at the time. The baby was fussy,
which then in turn impacts their attachment with each other. right? Because of the artificialness. And then by, creating a more facilitating environment that would enhance their bond and connection with each other, with the kid, the adolescent with her own daughter, that can create a sense of separateness from her being sexually exploited. So I love that example. That is awesome. So I'm sorry.
I said, no, it was a nice experience for them.
Yeah, and I'm sure it went a long way for lots of things, I'm assuming. And so also when you're thinking about behavior management, you do definitely need to give caregivers some more enhanced behavioral strategies with really thinking about, and this, I'm more of a cognitive behavioral person, so this is more behavioral terms, but we want to see more positive or pro-social behaviors, and we want to decrease negative behaviors, keeping in mind that we know a lot of the behaviors that these youth exhibit are related to their exploitation history. The other thing I would argue, depending on the caregivers, is sometimes they may need also just basic parenting skills, particularly if it's a bio parent. They may have limited parenting skills. My clinical experience is often caregivers sort of go from two extremes, from being extremely permissive, or they had been permissive and maybe neglectful, and then sort of go to what the authoritarian style of parenting, where they like take everything away, they're very punitive, they're very controlling, after the sexual exploitation happens, which, just as an aside, is very similar to what traffickers do as well. So let's, so that can be problematic. So you have to sort of assess the caregiver's sort of parenting skills and where they're at to recognize what they may need. As I mentioned before, you also have to get caregivers to begin to realize and sort of distinguish between what we would call typical adolescent behaviors, like eye rolling or wanting to be with their peers more if they're, so sort of thinking about that versus the atypical adolescent behaviors, which is self-harm, leaving care for extended periods of times, using drugs on a daily basis. And so getting caregivers to kind of begin to recognize, because they really often focus on the atypical behaviors and also kind of get stuck on the typical behaviors. And you're like, kind of like the example that you mentioned earlier about the swearing, right? If you have a youth who's actively using drugs and leaving care all the time, the least of your worries is profanity at that point in time. We can deal with profanity later, but let's target the more severe behaviors. So I think that's a good example. And really want to be thinking about our focus is on reducing severe injury, harm, or death. So the behaviors that you want to make sure that they have some strategies or skills for are when the youth leaves care, if the youth is still actively being exploited, either by a trafficker or returning to trafficking, substance misuse. We can have a whole webinar about what we mean by that, but really thinking about severe substance dependence or chronic drug use. Recruiting behavior is often a problematic behavior that you may have to deal with that can potentially harm others and is a part of being trafficked, and then refusing school. So these are the things that the caregivers are often sort of pulling their hair out about because they don't know what to do with them. And so here's an example related to another behavior related to dangerous cell phone and social media use. And so this is another thing that caregivers struggle with, and a couple of things to just sort of be thinking about. You want to talk about strategies to avoid and why. Sort of extensive versus dangerous use. I think it's really important to recognize, and this was something that came up early in the days of doing this work, is that for youth to be placed in a residential treatment facility, they had to give up their phone for 60 days or 90 days or something like that. And we often joke, and like, how many of us would be willing to give up our phone for that long? Like, I think most of us, would maybe have a panic attack after an hour of not having our phone. And so recognizing that having a phone is a way of life, there's also a lot of harm reduction strategies that you can use with the phone. So recognizing that there's pros about having a phone and cons. And so we really make a distinction of what do you do if you have a youth who is misusing, if they're using it for trafficking, if they're, sharing photos, if they're interacting with sex buyers online, or if they're being contacted by the traffickers. Those are the type of behaviors that you want to be responsive to and having conversations about. So, you definitely want to have conversations with the youth about it. What are the rules? Kind of talking about, it may be a situation where they used to send photos. Just so you all know, about 40 to 50% of typical adolescents exchange sexual content photos as sort of a normal course of engaging in relationships. So you have to decide what is typical and what is not typical. And then, but having conversations of how to reduce the harm. And then also having conversations about what do you do if your trafficker reaches out to you? What are the strategies? So I think the first thing that caregivers need to be doing with this is having open and honest conversations about the misuse of either the cell phone or the social media.
So what are our takeaways? When we talk about kind of working directly with caregivers or intervening with them, that they need support and oftentimes want support. They may not always be aware of it. And sometimes that support is in comes in various degrees, whether it be, helping meet basic needs, food shelters, assisting them to find food pantries, getting uniforms for their kids for school, but also that emotional support. People don't often sit down with them during the course of treatment and say, how can we help you? What would help you get through this? And so really, showing that kind of genuine regard for their well-being as well will go a long way. The next thing is psychoeducation. We throw around the word psychoeducation so frequently, and it really is very involved. And it, if done correctly, will really help the parent or the caregiver understand the youth's dynamics very well and kind of help them be a little bit more empathic or understanding of some of their behaviors. So even, when we do a component of experiential learning, when we talk about trauma with our foster parents and really helping them use that experiential exercise to understand kind of what the youth might have gone through, really kind of sends a resounding message to them. But also, it helps normalize the caregiver's reactions, teaching them that, anger is normal. It's normal to feel this way. By doing it, it'll help, strengthen the caregiver-child relationship. And really kind of just having the caregiver help the youth really with their own self-awareness and, emotional regulation, confidence, so on and so forth. And then finally, cultivate a trauma-informed caregiver style. And we really want to make sure that the parents understand trauma on so many levels, from a neurological neurodevelopment approach to, their own, trauma stress reactions. And by doing that, they will be able to kind of, again, be at ease with some of their stressors, be more understanding of the child, and then, be open, if nothing else, to, implementing and developing new kind of parenting strategies. Like, okay, I get it now. With this child, I have to do this differently. It's not that I didn't do it right or I've been a bad parent. It's that they need a little bit of a different approach.
There are some great points about intervening with caregivers. Dr. Omar, would you mind sharing a little with us about some of the unique considerations when working with caregivers of youth who are living in congregate care settings?
Sure. And we've spent a lot of time talking about caregivers today. We often refer to foster parents or biological parents, but a large part of youth live in group homes type settings or with multiple other youth in foster homes or so on and so forth, or relational care. And so it's really important to understand that this population of staff are, caregivers in the same right as everyone else, yet they have some nuances in terms of kind of the needs. Obviously, they're expected to be professionals at all times. So, the youth, can spit at them, kick them, tell them I hate you. But guess what? Their reaction wouldn't be as easily validated if they were to react strongly. So they do have additional pressures in that regard. Um, we often have the same expectations of them that we have all the other caregivers, provide shelter, provide, safety, so on and so forth. But then they do have, but we don't always give them the same supports. And by supports, simple as an example of validating their feelings, helping them, providing them psychoeducation on their own self-care strategies or their own compassion fatigue. And that happens there as well, because it can be very challenging. So there tend to be a lot of pressures, and the congregate care staff, when their youth are misbehaving, they are often the ones who are first people who are identified as part of the problem. Like, okay, so what did you do wrong? Let's do a root cause analysis and figure out kind of like what happened under your watch that the youth eloped. So we wouldn't necessarily do that with a parent or a caregiver in another reaction, but there's often that sense of feeling blamed as well, just in a different capacity for the youth's behavior. Another point is, we said, be aware that congregate care staff have different levels of buy-in. For some people, they're like, this is a job, I get, overtime, it's close to home. So they may not have the same sensitivities as others. We've been able to see that some people were really destined for this. When we see how they interact with kids, it's just so natural. And others are there to, make sure that they don't hurt themselves, and I'm just going to watch them. I'm not going to try to engage more than I have to. And so there's definitely different approaches. Are they wrong? We try to encourage, we try to provide supports and trainings and say, like, try to talk to the kids a little bit more, try to do this differently, but it's not always the case. And finally, they're faced with a lot of additional challenges. And I mean, I think this point right here, we could do a whole training on it. Some as simple as, many of them experience burnout. It's very hard to staff these types of settings for the very explanations I gave. So many times there's a lot of turnover. Turnover with new staff requires a lot of training. So there's a lot of people who are early in their knowledge. We have the same expectations of them in terms of being kind of objective and understanding and supportive as we would a therapist with 10 or 15 years of experience when they've been on the job just a few weeks or a couple of months. They often, like I said earlier, might have a lot of overtime, so they might experience burnout. They might have different levels of setting limits. Some staff might be more fearful of the kids, others might be more stern. These are settings where, a lot of the parents we're talking about, they have their one youth who is the identified patient, if you will, who's the child who's, been experiencing human trafficking, sometimes too. But most of the time it is just, the one child that there's the focus on. Whereas in a group home, there's multiple youth that they're focusing on and trying to kind of provide the same level of attention to each. So, I mean, I think and I think we can go on, I mean, just in terms of different struggles that they might face. But I think that's the main thing that we want to get across, is that they have a lot of the same expectations, sometimes more, but less support, excuse me. So more expectations and less support. And so what can we do to kind of parallel, the work we're doing with our biological or parent caregivers?
Absolutely. So this information is so helpful in just thinking about engaging and working with caregivers of youth who've experienced trafficking and exploitation. I wonder, Dr. Blocker, if you could share some ideas of resources that might be helpful for caregivers of youth impacted by trafficking.
Yes, absolutely. The good news is there are some resources, which is fantastic. So the first one I want to highlight is the National Child Traumatic Stress Network trafficking webpage. There is the work group, which I'm a part of, has created multiple resources and handouts on sort of what are the vulnerabilities of youth who've been sexually exploited, what are some of the facts that we know about sexual exploitation. So if you're a clinician and or a caregiver, you can go there and check out those resources, and there will be continued resources that will be updated. So that is definitely one place I strongly recommend going. And you're thinking about psychoeducation, often our caregivers like, handouts or, pamphlets or things where that they can concretely take something home with them, or also some of them are more visual learners versus sort of auditory learners. So absolutely go there. And then a couple other resources. In California, there's an emphasis on implementation of harm reduction strategies. So CDSS, California Department of Social Services, did create a harm reduction series, and there is a handout that is available related for caregivers and how to, what are the philosophies and interventions related to harm reduction for caregivers. In addition, my colleague and I, Dr. Brandy Lyles, were asked by CDSS to create a web course for caregivers of youth experiencing sex trafficking and exploitation. And so this is a free web course, which has 3 modules, talks about both sex trafficking and labor trafficking, talks about meeting the needs of the youth with really some more practical parenting strategies, and then also talks about secondary traumatic stress and self-care strategies. Because as we mentioned before, we know there's lots of demands on our caregivers, and they also may have their own trauma history. Another resource that is not listed on here is a parent toolkit that was created by the Children of the Street Society. And so, we have it. Awesome. So you just have to give your email and they'll give it to you for free. It is about 80 pages, so it is good to break it up, but it's an excellent resource, and it's something that we have used when we're working with caregivers. Here's some other additional resources through NCTSN that sort of focus on how do you enhance sort of understanding about thinking about trauma and how it impacts the youth that we're working on. And then there's also the resource parent curriculum training modules, which has very specific strategies in supporting resource families and resource caregivers, which is foster parents. And then lastly, these are just some additional resources. The family engagement and involvement in trauma and mental health talks about what's importance of family engagement, why it's important, barriers and sort of strategies to overcome those barriers. And then the last resource, at least listed here, is trauma among families with substance abuse. And so provides a sort of picture of the challenges that we all have when we're working with caregivers and kiddos who may have substance abuse.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to both of you. I just want to let everyone know that we do have the recent webinars, our first 3 webinars that are available on YouTube. This webinar will also be recorded and put up on YouTube, so please look for that soon. And I just want to thank Dr. Blacker and Dr. Omar for coming here today and sharing your perspectives and your guidance on working with caregivers. And thank you to everyone out there who joined us today.